University as adjunct associate professor in order to support our doctoral programs offered in collaboration with the Austrian Academy of Psychology. She will be talking to us today about figures as occupiers of space. So, let's hear your talk.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you very much for the invitation and for having me. It's a great pleasure to be on Cyprus for the first time. And so I'll just start. This is just one of my research strands, but it's the most long-standing one, so I'm not talking about everything I'm doing, but just about a small segment of a series of experiments which have occupied me since quite a while. It was not easy to publish it because this is a very comprehensive area of research. So I'll say something about the Piagetian theory of spatial cognition, and if you are studying education and child development, you probably know about that. And then I'll say something about spatial binding and frames, and that comes more from a physiological perspective. I'll say something about the A0B task in infants, which is a classical task in developmental research, which is interesting because it's being investigated from several theoretical perspectives, inclusively neural networks. And then I'll say something about regions and frames, spatial frames, and that is more from visual perception research. So you can see there are several perspectives on the same topic, or several disciplines who are working on this topic. And I'll say something about place learning during repetition, and I'll say something about salient places, that is, how can we learn pure places, and I'm saying something about wrong places, and that is the offside position in football. So, so you can see that we're coming from a very theoretical to a more applied way of doing research. So let's start with a slide on the Piagetian theory. What you get in Piagetian theory is something that is quite crucial. So we have because Piaget was in very close contact with Heisenberg and with Einstein. And so they were discussing the different types of space systems. So we have here the space systems, which is like space with all the planets and so on, so it's basically empty. Then we've got the space system, which is like the medieval concept, where you have a ground line and then you have the bird view and the diagonal view, and this is the concept of infinity, where the spatial axes are actually merging somewhere in the far distance. He made a huge difference between what he called figurative space, that is the space which basically takes place in space system 1, and he said that is defined by figures. Say I'm close to you and further away from you in the back, and so this space concept, the figurative space concept, is the topological space concept, while these ones here are Euclidean space concepts, projective space concepts. So he tested that in this kind of areas. So he had a place that would take a mouse. Can you see the mouse?
Yeah.
Also in the map. Okay. So he had this place and he said, can you put up the figures in a way that A and B is connected? Okay. So you can see in phase A, which is always equivalent to H, there is no connection between A and B, but they just cluster. By the way, this is also how young boys play football. They cluster. They think if they are very, very close, then they are very, very powerful. So they don't distribute themselves strategically on the field. So this is the next phase where they understand that there must be some lineup. So you could say this is the discovery of the spatial axis. But they kind of can conceptualize the diagonal. And you can see how these corners are still very important in the next sub-stage, where they line it up, but they can't get the line of sight straight. So this is the highest level of figurative space, where you can see that figurative space and axial space has become identical. Okay, so it's a straight line. And this is later on at the end of my talk, when I talk about the offside rule. This would be the line of the defense, and the offside place is behind the line of the defense of the ball. Okay? Okay, now how do young children draw areas? So these are the models, and you can see these. Normally, if you would draw that, you would draw that as spatial axes, and then like a grid, and they would intersect. But this is not how young children draw a grid. And what you can see are they draw the individual objects. So it's not quite clear whether they are drawing a place or whether they are drawing an object that is a brick. Okay. So when we say that young children are more focused on the object, let's have a look at rats. And in the research with rats, we have Cheng, who also worked with people like Liz Berkeley from Harvard, and they had only empty spaces. And because these rats are so small, they would analyze how the rats would run, okay? And they found the same thing like Piaget, and is they had the corners which were somehow gravitational centers. So the rats would tend to run in one corner or into the other corner, depending on the physical geometry of the room. So this was, for instance, black, and this was white, so you can see this is marked black color, white color, and the object would be food. But the geometric cues were quite important for the rats, and that's why Cheng said there may be a geometric module in the rat where the room, the array itself, is important and not the object. Now, I'm coming to the second part of the theories, and that's the physiological part. So in our brain, we have different areas in the brain. So this here is the back of the brain, and this is the occipital lobe, and this is the primary incoming, the area for the incoming visual stimuli. So we have basically the shadows inside, like in Plato's cave. We have the shadows at the back of our brain, and then the brain becomes selected. So in the parietal lobe, we have the arrays, and in the temporal lobe, we have the objects. Okay? So they are processed separately. And what happens then is we put some network in the brain. So I said this is the visual projection area, color and shape, motion and layout. And in the front of the brain, these different percepts or focus of attention are being bound together. So this object and place binding takes place in the front of the brain, in the frontal lobes. And this is why we call that binding. Okay. Now, this is the object-pile theory of Anna Treisman. And Anna Treisman says, well, the important part now is what are, in perception, is what are you looking at? So we've got an attention window, and there's a huge debate in experimental psychology whether this attention window selects objects or whether it selects places. Obviously, it can do both. And so we've got different maps, color maps, motion maps, location maps, which stands for the different brain areas. But the question is now, what is being selected? And she makes the claim that we have object-defined locations. So we have a location, but you must have a placeholder for that location. Otherwise, the location is just a feature of the object. Okay? So this is where I'm standing as a speaker. This is my place. Okay? So in this way, I'm territorial because I occupy this place at least for an hour. Right. So we have an object and defined place. And so she calls that object finance because all the features of these objects are being contained in an object file. And that, of course, is contradictory in comparison to if you select the place first, you know. Right, so I'm a developmental psychologist, so I'm interested in how children develop. And so I had to get all this together. And I thought, well, maybe it works like this. The objects here overshadow the place. So along with Treisman, the place is a feature of the object. And this is the what and where system, the physiological what and where system. But because young children are very slow, the place can't enter. So they are just embarking on what they are seeing, and that is the object, okay? And forget about the place. So in this way, objects are territorial because they overshadow the places. Now children become older and they become faster. And because they are faster, the objects need less time and there's a bit more time left over for the place. So the place has an entry in this what and where system as well. And then, but what we want is place learning. So how does the place become independent of the object that occupies the place? Because this still exists when I'm gone, okay? So how does this flexibility develop to realize that this is a pure special place, a landmark place with a microphone and so on? So the idea is that at some point these places are being handled separately and then entered not individually like here where you have object place finding, but they are grouped and then entered into the what and where system. So let's start with, I said I'm a developmental psychologist, so let's start with babies. Okay. Now this is a study on the A not B concept, and it works like that. You show an infant of 6 to 7 months, an object, and you hide it in place A. And then, if the infant is 6 months old, it grabs the object which has hidden. If they're younger, they don't. And this is why Piaget said, well, they are out of sight, out of mind. Okay. Now, if you move the object to place B, then the object, then the infant searches again in place A instead of place B. Now, we call that perseveration. And that's something that is also an important concept, say, in neuropsychology, where we have patients who also show perseverative search. They search and search again in the same place where they have searched before. And only at 9 to 10 months, they start searching in a second place. So this is an experiment of George Butterworth, which is quite interesting because this is a nice experimental test why this is the case, because we can't really tell what infants are seeing, can't we? So instead he modified this classic search space and made one half colorful. In a second variation, it's still the classic search space, but he made the place itself colorful. Then he combined both and he made the half spatial field plus the place distinct from the other side. And in this variation, he actually rotated the whole thing. or repeated the whole thing. And this is now the error. So you can see this is 60% wrong. And the black column is the spatial structure that you've seen before. So we've got classic, background, places, rotated and repeated from the previous slide. And then you've got the transfer. And in learning, if you learn something, we always, as psychologists, we always see whether you can actually transfer what you've learned onto a new problem. So the transfer involved the classic area again. So if we call that segmentation. So if we segment it for them, will they be able to use the sort of segmentation in the classic unstructured area again? What you can see is the more we structure, the less mistakes they make. But if you give them the classic area, they make the same mistake again. So nothing that they've learned actually sticks. They just follow the visual cue, but nothing sticks. And this is something where all the Piagetians said, yes, you have to have a concept, an internal mental concept, and you can teach them, but it doesn't stick. You know, why? Because they haven't grasped the concept, you know? Right. So I did an experiment with individual versus isolated places. Remember this experiment with the drawings where they had all the individual sticks and bricks, and we have now one experiment where we asked them, where I had infant-sized tables. So I would take one table and another table and say, these are two tables, and I put them here and there, and so we've got two places and we make them really salient. But different to the Butterworth experiment, there weren't any color cues. They were the same color, and that makes it harder, but they were isolated, so 1 and 2, put them together. Then in a follow-up experiment, we had the same places, but we had an air gap in between. So the spatial separation between these two places is clearly visible, okay? So, and it stays visible. And this is the result. So we have here the continuous table, that's the control condition. If you had just the tables 1 and 2 and you pushed them together and the gap wasn't visible, nothing happened. But if you have here place A is gray and place B is black, and this is now successful object search, not the amount of errors. This is the control group. So they had the classic array, and you can basically see nothing happens. You know, they have one trial and another trial, and they repeat it again, and they don't learn a thing. If anything happens, really, if they get worse during the repetition. But here, you can see that this is place A, and this is place B, and all of a sudden, if there is an air gap in between, performance shoots up, so they improve, but then you give them the continuous table and nothing gets transferred. So you can see that this is the same result like the Butterworth experiment, only that we achieved this result without using color. Okay, so there was just this air gap, and isolation helped. So what we created was object place binding. Right? One object, one place, and a clearly different second unit, one object, one place. Okay, so the hypothesis now is what is actually happening in perseveration is you are after the object, so it's being hidden, you retrieve it, you've got success, okay, so you've got success in one location, then it's being hidden in a second location, and then you ask yourself, oh, where's the object? And you search again in location A, and that's the perseveration, possibly because of the success. While the older infants, they would change from object to place. And I've been thinking how I should describe that for young people your age. And I thought, well, maybe if you say object, and object is you are always after your man or after your woman, okay? So you stick with your partner all the time. But the more mature way would be to say, well, this is my object, and now I fall in love with the place instead, okay? So you are saying, this is my region, I look in this region to find the object, rather than being after the object all the time, because otherwise you can't detach from the first place to the second place. Okay, now the next question was for me, let's have a look what actually happens during the task. And I find that very interesting. So I'm interested in how we learn with repetition. I did a lot of neural network studies, and these computers learn a lot just by doing 2,000 swipes of the same thing, and then they get the breakthrough. Or the man would say, well, we put the hours in, and then we manage, and we're better. So I reanalyzed a study of Bremner and Bryant, and here you have the A place, success in the place A, and here you've got the success in place B. And you can see this is first, second, third, fourth, fifth trial, just repetition, and see how they close the gap. But there are some infants in one study, there are some individual differences, and they don't improve. They deteriorate, okay? Now this is something really important, because some people are trying hard and they don't achieve anything, you know? So this is quite an important question in learning. Why are some people trying hard and think it's so unfair, I've tried hard and I still don't get there, and others are putting in the hours and they get there, you know? They are nearly as good at the end as in trial A. So I worked in Scotland, and there we had mothers who thought if they were breastfeeding, they would be cows. And they didn't want to be a cow, so they didn't breastfeed. So I had quite a significant portion of infants who had never been breastfed, never. And this is the study with where I plotted the data, 80 infants, and these are the broken lines are the bottle-fed infants, and these are the breastfed infants. Now what you can see is these are now 6 to 8 month old infants, and what you can see is that even the 6 to 8 month old infants improve, even if it's still below chance level. So they hit it only every third time, but they close the gap, while the infants who are bottle-fed don't learn a thing. And now we've got the 8 to 10 months old, and you can see that again, the breastfed infants close the gap, and they show intelligent search behavior, while in the bottle-fed infants, nothing happens. The interesting thing is, just one anecdote, that these bottle-fed infants are extremely polite. So if you ask them to hand back the toy, they give you the toy. If I asked a breastfed infant and they were searching for the toy and they got it, they wouldn't give it. They were like that, no. And I thought, oh my God, I better get a whole box full of toys for those infants, okay? So there's something in human infants where they're actually after the toy, even though it is not food, and that makes it different to rats, doesn't it? Okay. So what we can now say on a more abstract level is that there's a gradual detachment and dissociation going on from the object, and they become better in discovering non-obvious features such as the place of an object. And there are trade-offs between successful performance and non-successful performance, even in infants. You also get that in older children, in older adults, because we call that cognitive resources. So you have a certain mental capacity, and in older adults, the mental capacity, if they're not training, it goes down, you know. Right, so now let's come to the older children. In adults, the place memory is always better than the object memory. Does that mean they are not anymore after the object? But from a developmental perspective, you would say if children have figurative space, so if space is defined by figures, then figures and objects should have priority in young children. Older children would be either the same in place memory or better. Now look at this. This is from visual perception. This is from Stephen Palmer, and he said there's something special about space, how we group in space, and he called his principle a new Gestalt principle, and he called that grouping by common region. So he also said that boundaries define space and can override the common and shared features. So normally in Gestalt, you all know that from your first year in psychology, you group by spatial proximity and by similarity. But if you look at these are close together, okay? But you have a boundary, and what you see is this unit, and you don't see those which are close together. Same here. These are really similar, okay? But because there is what we call an explicit boundary, which you've got across your town as well, an explicit boundary, even those objects which don't belong together are encoded together, are grouped together. So he said spatial boundaries actually are a second-order Gestalt principle. But look at this. If you have figures like that, you have this object coding back again. So you've got one object per place, and this is what he calls the smallest region. So it's like a core notion of how we deal with it. So this is so much in science is actually a chance finding, and this was a chance finding because I had this paper of Stephen Palmer lying about, and my son was about 4 to 5 years old, and he started scribbling on my paper, and this is what he did. And then I thought, oh my God, I better follow this up, because this is the Wertheimer display, and what he did with this was he circled every single one, and so I called that initially individual coding, but then called that object place binding. This is unsystematic, so you can see examples of nearly everything, and so I call these the unsystematic coders, and this is the perfection. So you've got those which are close to each other are coded together in one region, and those who are similar, or which are similar, are coded together in one region, and this is where there's no difference between those dots, and they are coded into common regions. So we thought, and this is important because that's an important feature through the rest of the talk, this is object place, and this is region coders. Okay, now this is the first experimental task. Here you have the topological frame with objects. Here you've got the grid, which should be the Euclidean task. Okay, now these are the objects that they were supposed to remember, but they were presented in a randomized sequence. So they never saw the whole gestalt of these 3 memory sets. This was how it worked. This is the presentation. This is presented in the delay. So that was a what or a where interference, so either movement or color. And then we've got the place, the shape test. And this is the place test. So in the place test, you have just They just had to say yes or no. This place was occupied or not. Okay, this is the entire task. You can read this up if you want in the Swiss Journal of Psychology. So we have here again the presentation, here the what or the where interference, and here the shape or the place test. Now this is the result of the drawing task, and you can see this is 5, 6, 8, 11 years in adults. So you can see how this object place finding goes down rapidly, that's the black columns, how the unsystematic coding is what we call a transitional pattern that emerges and decreases again, and how this region coding of objects that belong together into one region increases until it reaches ceiling in adults. And this is now, these are now the memory data, and what you can see here is that the 4 to 5-year-olds remember more objects, and they hardly remember any places, and then later on they are good in remembering objects and places. Now there was one finding that really rattled my theoretical stamina, and that was a priming effect. This is basically how I embarked into all this cognitive science, because my developmental theories didn't tell me anything about that. What happened was, when they experienced the grid, they were in the first session. In the second session, they were about 10% better in the repetition. But if they had experienced this first, there was no improvement on that. The first transfer, where I get an improvement, okay? So I call that an array priming effect. That is, if you have a highly structured array that helps you with an unstructured array, yeah? Okay. So, there was, well, I'll skip that. This is what we call visual mapping. So if they were in reaction times, if they had object placed and the grid, they saved some time. If there was a mapping between what they encoded in the drawing and what they experienced in the external array. So they saved about 400 milliseconds or 300, so about 400 milliseconds in either, if there was some harmony between their inner concept and their outer concept. I found that quite interesting, so I added this drawing performance to the memory recall. And the important thing is, sometimes you ask yourselves, is it all inside my mind or is it out there? Okay. Now, if you added the internal concept to this memory task, all these array effects, the priming effects, became non-significant. And this is exactly what I said before about the infancy research. If you've got the concept, you don't need the external cues. If you have the cues, it only helps long-term if you've got the concept. If you don't have the concept, you just follow the cues, there's no transfer. Okay, now this was water on the mills of the conceptualists. This is about individual differences. I can come back to that. Well, maybe have a look at this one here. These are girls and these are boys, and you can see the girls at 8 years are very good in object and places, but the boys at 8 years are still better in objects than in places. So you can see that this object priority can linger on for quite a while. This was a special sample, so in the boys, socioeconomic status explained 63% of the differences between the boys. And when you added the coding, still 49% were explained by socioeconomic differences between their parents. They are 7 years old, you know, and then in the girls, age explained 58% of the of the variance. If you added the CRT in girls, 88% of the differences between the girls were explained by age. So you can see that the boys were very, very competitive, and there were huge differences on the basis of their context. Now the question is, or the question of the next experiment was, is it the case that the more spatial structure there is, the more helpful it is? So the prediction would be that this would be difficult, this would be easier, and this would be easiest. Okay? These were the memory sets, again like before, but we have red and green, and then a repetition again. Now this is the result for let me just see. All right, well maybe, okay. Let's do it this way, okay. So here can you see this first prediction shows that empty space is good for objects, but it's terrible for places. So if there's no spatial structure, places are very difficult to remember, but the objects are good to remember. But spatial structure doesn't help objects, it helps mainly the places. So, but there was not the predicted difference between the frame and the grid. So if you have lots of individual places like in the grid, it didn't really help. Why? Because the grid produces many what we would call cognitive units. So instead of dealing with one unit, like in the frame, you deal with 9 units, okay, which can cause an overload. So this was the frame. Why was that so good? Because it narrowed down the area where the objects could appear. Okay, so there was less scanning involved. Now the shocking part of, or the interesting part, is that in the children, they didn't learn a single place in this experiment. Now this block 1, 2, 3, and 4. Remember, red, green, and the places just go down. So they forgot more and more and more places, but they learned the object shapes. Okay. While in the adults, look at the dark columns, it goes up and up and up and up. Now the important thing to realize is, and this is in accordance with this model that I showed you at the beginning, where I say, well, the speed that children become faster in thinking plays a role is, if you look at these reaction times, they're around 1,000 milliseconds. If you look at the adults, they have the double speed. So, of course, they have more resources. That was something that was difficult for Piaget initially, so they have more resources, more capacity, because they are faster, so they can do more in the same time. Now let's have a look how they learn in empty space. And what you can see here, that again in empty space, this is now object place finders in the drawing text, and object region coders. And what you can see is that the object place finders were actually quite good. They remembered quite a number of objects, about 60%. But here, the object region coders remembered less objects and even less places at that, in this type of array. Now, if you look at the frame is basically the best area, or the best array to learn places. Why is that? Look at this, they are very, very good in learning places, not in learning places, but in remembering places. So they don't improve a lot because they are already as good in places as the other ones were in objects. And here you can see that the places go down and up again when they code object places, but the objects go up, they go up. So this region coding in combination with the frame was the best condition for children to learn places. And this is now the grid, and we would have thought that this is the most explicit denotation because there are lots of boundaries, but what you can see is that it doesn't help place learning. They just about maintain their level, and here the objects are again better than the places, and this is because the grid also offers this object place finding, what the frame doesn't. Okay, so this is just the conclusions. Now the question is, none of these areas facilitated place learning like in the adults, and why is that the case? So can we drill children to learn places, which is completely different to the conceptual learning of, say, the Piaget theory or the Piagetians? So I ran the same experiment, but now with novel memory sets and repetitive memory sets. So do novel objects, because they're exciting, stimulate place learning, or does repetition help more of the same? So these are the objects, the repetitive on top, the diverse on the bottom, and what you can see here is that this is the novel set, and you can see it all goes downhill. If they have novel memory sets, there's marked deterioration of both object and place memory. But if you repeat it, it's brilliant. So they learn the objects, they're very good at it, they even become better. They also become better in place. So finally, we've got the place learning, but we have place learning. Why? Because it was always the same object. And what we get in infancy research and in these school children is what we call dishabituation, or habituation. So here you could say, this is not the case, you know, because interest goes up, memory improves, both in objects and in places. But my hypothesis was that this only happens because the objects themselves became boring. That is, they became embedded in memory, but they lost their saliency. So we would, from these results, we would say saliency is not good. It's exciting. It's not good for memory. Repetition is good because it ingrains the objects and the places into memory, and via the repetition, the children learn both. The full object file, basically, the shape and the place. Okay. There was also an interesting finding. There was a trade-off that during the experiment, the reaction times for place became faster, and the reaction times for objects became slower. Okay? So this was even on a physiological level. There was a trade-off between objects and places during the experiment. Right. The question now is, what was the result? Why did we get this result that if you've got novel stimuli, why does the memory score go down? So we analyzed the false alarms, and what we get in the false alarms are that false alarms went up. And who knows what a false alarm is? No. Well, you've got a distractor, which is a place that was not occupied, or a shape that was not shown during the presentation, and you say yes. Although it was not there, you think it was there, and that's a false alarm. Okay? So the false alarms went up in the novelty condition. They always thought they had seen everything before, but they didn't. But it stayed the same in the repetitive condition. And age, false alarms in 7-year-old children increase with practice. In 9-year-old children, they decrease with practice. And the object placed by practice was, while false alarm for shape memory stayed low during the repetitions. For, I'll explain that. It was a four-way interaction, which is actually easier to understand than these bullet points. So these are the 7-year-olds with the novel memory set. And what you can see is holistic perception. So object and shape goes up together and goes down together. Okay. So there is this object place binding, nicely illustrated and demonstrated in holistic perception, but in the 9-year-olds, that's disappeared. Okay, so there are no false alarms. If you have that for the repeated session, for the repeated sets, you can see that in the 7-year-olds, the reaction times for places go up and the false alarms as well. So there's the deterioration. In the 9-year-olds, the false alarm for places go down and the reaction times accelerate. So they become able to control their false alarms. They are much more, they've got much more what we call discrimination, what they've seen before and what they haven't seen before. Okay. And that is also mirrored in the reaction time. So those children who were object place encoders had longer latencies for shapes than for places. The unsystematic coders had the same reaction times for object shapes and places, and the object region coders had longer place than shape latency. So you could see the bias, but that was only in the novelty condition where you had different types of memory sets. So they started using spatial categories. But in the repeated condition, they didn't use spatial categories. Nothing. And it was only that place latencies were always longer than shape latencies. So the CRT had no impact, so there was no spatial coding going on in the repetitive condition. So here we can now make a theoretical distinction. So you can say, okay, Piaget was right, the conceptualists were right, theoretically, if you have diverse objects. But if you have always the same object, and I was just saying there are real-life situations where you always have the same object, you don't use your category system anymore. Okay? So you are just in that what we would call the habit system, rather than a conceptual system. Basically, it says that here you don't make plans, while here you develop strategies and you make plans. Okay, so I asked myself, are these objects really in the way? If all these diverse objects make it difficult to remember anything of them, are they in the way? If you always have the same objects, does that facilitate memory? So would it be best then, if you are keen on learning places, would it be best if there weren't any objects at all? So then you should be really best in learning places. So now the question is, what do I do in order to make these places more salient, more than just a feature, according to Treisman, a feature of the object? So I make the places themselves salient. So we have colorful places and degraded objects. So now the objects are all the same. They are uniform. They don't have any individuality. They are just stars. And this was the presentation array. And then we have 3 retrieval conditions. Do you know what a retrieval is? The retrieval is first they see something, then there's the delay in the memory task, and then they get the test display. Okay, so the test display can be either the full array with the place, the placeholder, and the array, or it can be the place and the placeholder, which would be the object place binding, or it can be, and this is now the geometric module in the rats, it would be what I would call the place pure. Okay, right. Now let's see what happens next. The interesting thing, this is under review, and I never had data like that before. What you always learn in psychology and developmental psychology is that you become faster with age, and you're at the peak of your reaction times when you're your age, beginning of 20. So what I got now was a result that the reaction times were array specific, and I didn't get a single significant effect of age. So I had 5 to 6-year-olds, 7 to 8-year-olds, 9 to 10-year-olds, and all of them show the same pattern. That is, if there is a place pure, they are very fast. If there is a place and a placeholder, they take a little longer. And if there's the place, the placeholder, and the array, they take a long time to look. Okay, so that's now under review, and we'll see what the reviewers are saying to that, but I don't know of any comparable data set. And they all learned their places. That's the good news. The bad news, or not the bad news, is the interesting thing was that the delay, the type of delay was now more important than the actual array. And what you can see is that these are the girls only. So the girls show less false alarms. And now comes the surprise, when only the colored places were shown. That is the place pure. Okay, so you can see here, these are the false alarms, and this is the place only. This is the place and placeholder, and this is the place and placeholder and the array. Okay, now you can see that the false alarms are minimal in places only. So they seem to have what I call a geometric module. And the placeholders were in the way. Now these are the boys, and the boys can't see anything. So they have, across conditions, they have the same amount of false alarms. Now I come to the rehabilitation part of the boys. So learning about the wrong place, judging the offside rule in football. So you remember all my spatial fields, and what I was interested in is, can you have a place not that is salient, but a place that is wrong? Because most of the time you have things that are right and things that are wrong. So in football we have spatial cognition plus a moral layer. Things, rules, that you follow, that you can break, referee, and so on. So the offside position, for those who don't know it, is that a player takes an unfair advantage by getting closer to the goal and having cutting out all the defense players. So he stands basically face to face, like in a penalty. So he stands face to face with the goalie. So the question now was, can 7 and 9-year-olds, the same age as those before, identify if a figure is in the wrong place? We also asked the children for their experience, because that's also a debate in spatial cognition. Either you have concepts or you learn by experience, repetition. And this is the result for the girls. And the boys, they play football or ball games not more than twice per month, once or twice per week, and more than 3 times per week. Okay, and the gray column are the girls, and the black column are the boys, and you can see most of them play football more than 3 times a week, This once or twice a week is about that there are even some more girls who play football games, but there are more girls who play football games just rarely. Okay, this is how we did it. I did that together with Georgia Bosco. She came to the London Met for a year to work with me. We trained them with the Subuteo game, which is the figure on top, and explained that to them, and then they were drawing into a ready-made spatial field the offside position, and we had them draw it so often until they got it right. And we counted the amount of drawings that they needed to get it right, okay? We had this score, and then we developed an offside rule task. So Georgia learned to program with E prime with the help of our technician. And so this looks a little bit like, this is from the FIFA. That's the official explanation. And we created the full football field. And here we have the offside position. And the player who had the ball, was shooting, could either be in an offside position or he was not in an offside position. And that was exactly what the children judged with their reaction time. So the offside position was easier to recognize than the not offside position. Now this is natural because a rule violation is already recognized by infants. In infancy experiments, if you violate a physical rule, they go like, oh, if something sinks into something which would be physically impossible, you know, we call that the expectation violation rule. So this violation was easier to spot than when they were not in an offside position, and that's also the case in adults. Now, when we added the learning criterion, that is how often they had to draw the offside position to get it right, this difference disappeared. So this showed our training had worked. And then now comes the rehabilitation of the boys part. What you can see here is that these are the offside trials, the black columns, and the gray trials are the non-offside trials. So these are girls and boys and girls and boys, okay? And these are the 7-year-olds and these are the 9-year-olds. So what you can see, and now I'll use the mouse, is that these are the girls, boys, boys. And you can see that the boys are much better in recognizing, significantly better in recognizing the offside trials than the non-offside trials. But this is only if we use the variable, how often they play football, in the analysis of variance. If we don't use their experience, their advantage of what they know on top of our training didn't become obvious. So experience does play a huge part. That was also obvious in the correlation. So in the two types of position judgment, place judgment, in girls correlated by 0.11, and that was not significant. And in boys it correlated with 0.64, and that was highly significant. So yes, there is an ability to learn about a wrong place. So this is now the summary. What I'm saying is that figure place binding represents a human core ability. There's a switch from object to place in tasks that require place learning. Repetition experience facilitates place learning because figures become less relevant. That is, a shape habituation takes place. Place salience facilitates via a geometric ability that we share with rats. And spatial field experience facilitates place processing. Spatial concepts have less to do with spatial fields than with object diversity. Now that was the most challenging for me to, because you also have to reconciliate yourself with your own preconceptions, you know, so everybody would say spatial concepts play a role to conceptualize the spatial field, and we've got those 5 types of spatial fields that I've shown you, spatial systems in the beginning, but the motor for that is object diversity. Okay, so my conclusions are figures are occupiers of space. To learn places well, object or figures must be non-existent, inhibited, thought away, be unimportant, be made unimportant. And if this sounds cruel to you, have a look at the following pictures. This is published in Developmental Psychology, an APA journal, and this is a drawing task in different spatial systems, and look at the size of these figures. Now, they are mini, so they are shrunk, okay? So this is the bird view, this is the drawing in the oblique perspective system. Now look at this one. This is quite interesting. This is a bird view, and then they expand, so they become larger again. So it's not just shrinking it, it's also expanding it. And this is why we would call that flexibility. Okay? So if you can control objects when you shrink them or expand them, that is an important ability that children learn at that age. Now here, this one has even a spatial configuration, like on a cube, the 5, and in the perspective, he has conserved the spatial configuration of the 5. And now look at the final one, and this is somebody who doesn't adapt at all. So there's no shrinking involved, and all the players are huge, and they stay huge in the perspective. So this is what we would possibly use as a predictor later on for being vulnerable to criticism or something, you know, because you have to stay big and you can't shrink. Okay, that was all.
Thank you.